Hello and welcome to Uncle Pete Knows. Today we're going to describe a current event which also has very, very deep historical roots. It's one of the oldest historical conflicts in human history. And the conflict is civilization versus savages, Israel versus Hamas. Historians often try to bifurcate or separate into two civilizations or societies when they compare them. And you can divide them up by saying which ones are patriarchies, or which ones are matriarchies, or which ones are nomadic cultures, or which ones are settled cultures, or hunter-gatherers versus farmers, literate cultures versus non-literate cultures. There's probably a dozen ways to separate them into two categories. But the most important difference that we should be concerned with today is civilized culture versus savage cultures. And what's the difference? Well, in civilized cultures, we do not torture people to death. In the rare cases where a civilized culture will impose torture, it's only directed at a few individuals in order to find information to prevent future killing. In other words, waterboarding a terrorist to find out when their next planned terrorist attack would be a justified form of torture. But civilized cultures do not torture people for fun or sadistic pleasure, or as a form of pure punishment. However, savage cultures do this all the time. They love torturing people. It's fun, and it's sadistic, and it's savage. Let's look at what Hamas did to Israeli civilians on October the 7th, 2023. Some Jewish women were gang raped to death. They were literally raped until they died from shock and loss of blood. Some of them were beaten to death during the process. Some Jewish men were tied up, had their fingers cut off, then their eyes gouged out, and their genitals cut off, all while they were still alive, and finally they were shot in the head. Now, some Jewish parents were tied up and forced to watch their babies being killed, put into ovens, the kitchen stove of the family, to watch their baby get burned to death. Hamas is obviously a savage group. Sadly, polls still indicate that most of the Muslims living in Gaza still support Hamas. Therefore, most of the Muslims living in Gaza are themselves savage. Throughout history, civilized cultures could only defend themselves from savage cultures by one of two ways. First, kill enough of the savages so that the few surviving savages finally give up. Or, number two, convert the savages to civilization. Unfortunately, converting militant Muslims to civilization is not possible. It would require them to give up their religion, because their religion actually calls for savage behavior. The Quran tells Muslims they can rob, rape, and kill non-Muslims with impunity. The Quran also says that Muhammad gave a noble example to Muslims for how to live. Well, Muhammad and his men raped captive women, and Muhammad personally tortured to death at least 3 of his opponents. So Muhammad set the standard for the savage behavior that Muslim warriors typically exhibit. Well, if militant Muslims cannot be converted to civilization, then the only other option is for the Israelis to kill as many savages living in Gaza as possible until the few survivors give up. Now you may think, oh, well, isn't bombing a city a war crime, a crime against humanity? No, not at all. In World War II, we bombed Tokyo, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Dresden, Berlin, Hamburg, and scores of other cities, killing literally hundreds of thousands of civilians. It was not a war crime. And that's not because we won the war. No. When the Germans bombed London, that was not a war crime either. No German Luftwaffe or officers or their superiors were ever convicted for a war crime for bombing civilians in England. Bombing civilians is not a crime because there's a chance they can survive. You see, it's a war crime if soldiers tie up a civilian and shoot him in the head, because there's no chance for that person to survive, and the killing was absolutely deliberate. But when you bomb a city, especially if you warn the civilians in the city that bombs will be coming, and those civilians are still in the city, and they get killed, that's just collateral damage. That's not a war crime. This is especially true when the civilians are supporting an evil regime. The people of Berlin and Tokyo were supporting evil regimes, evil, aggressive, horrible, savage regimes. The people in Gaza are supporting an equally savage regime called Hamas. Therefore, the civilians in Gaza are not innocent civilians.